I knew something was wrong when the streetlights started flickering at exactly 9 p.m. on that Tuesday night in Scottsdale, Arizona. And my neighbor Patricia was already speed walking toward my driveway, with her phone flashlight bouncing like a demented firefly. She had that look on her face, the one that said she was about to make someone else's problem into a community crisis, and I had the sinking feeling that someone was going to be me. Xavier Novak. She shrieked before I could even pretend I hadn't heard the doorbell. I was already halfway through my second beer, sitting in my garage workshop trying to finish a custom desk I'd been building for the past 3 weeks. The power had gone out about 15 minutes earlier, but I'd switched on my backup generator, a beast of a machine I'd purchased after the last summer's rolling blackouts. It was a commercial-grade unit, powerful enough to run my entire house plus my workshop tools without breaking a sweat. I walked to the front door, already regretting the decision to answer it. Patricia Hammond stood there in her HOA-issued polo shirt, the one she wore like a badge of authority whenever she wanted to remind everyone she was the vice president of our neighborhood association. She was flanked by 2 other women I recognized from the monthly meetings I tried desperately to avoid. "There's a situation," Patricia announced, pushing past me into my entryway like she owned the place. Her blonde highlights caught the light from my living room lamps, the only lights visible on our entire street. "The whole neighborhood is without power. The electric company says a transformer blew, and they can't get anyone out here until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest." "That's unfortunate," I said, already knowing where this was going but hoping I was wrong. "I'm sure everyone will manage for one night." "Xavier, don't be ridiculous. Mrs. Chen next door has a newborn baby. The Rodriguezes have medical equipment for their son. And the heat is supposed to hit 102 degrees tomorrow." She crossed her arms, and the 2 women behind her mirrored the gesture like synchronized swimmers. "We know you have a generator. We can hear it running." "Yeah, I have a generator for my house," I said slowly, emphasizing the last 2 words. "It's a backup system for my property." The HOA bylaws clearly state that in emergency situations, residents with resources must make them available for the common good of the community. Patricia said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through something that I was certain she'd either misinterpreted or completely fabricated. Section 12, Paragraph 4. I'd read those bylaws front to back when I moved into this planned community 2 years ago, specifically looking for any nonsense like this. That section is about sharing tools and equipment for community maintenance projects, not personal emergency backup systems. And it requires voluntary participation. "Well, this is an emergency and we're asking you to participate voluntarily," she said with a smile that could have curdled milk. "We just need you to run extension cords to the houses on our street, nothing major. Just enough to keep refrigerators running and some lights on." "Patricia, my generator is rated for my house. It's not designed to power an entire street. That's what the electrical grid is for." "It's just for one night," she insisted, and now her voice had taken on that wheedling quality that made my teeth hurt. "Maybe not even that long. The power company might fix it sooner." I looked past her at the 2 silent women who were nodding along like bobbleheads. One of them was definitely Sandra from 3 houses down, and the other might have been someone named Michelle or Melissa. They both had that same perfectly highlighted hair and that look of smug certainty that came from never being told no. "I'm sorry, but no. If you're worried about specific medical needs or babies, call emergency services. They have protocols for this, but I'm not running my personal equipment for the whole neighborhood." Patricia's expression shifted from fake sweet to ice cold in about half a second. "I see. So you're refusing to help your neighbors in a time of crisis. That's very disappointing, Xavier. Very disappointing indeed. She turned on her heel, gesturing for her companions to follow. The HOA board will be hearing about this. We have an emergency meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. I suggest you attend. After they left, I went back to my workshop, but the enjoyment had drained out of my evening. I knew Patricia Hammond and her crew well enough by now to understand that this wasn't over. Our HOA had a reputation for being aggressive, but I'd managed to stay under their radar mostly by keeping my property immaculate and following their endless rules about mailbox colors and approved plant species. The next morning arrived hot and bright, and the power was still out across our neighborhood. I could see people standing in their driveways looking miserable, and a few hardy souls had set up camping equipment in their front yards. My house, meanwhile, was cool and comfortable, running smoothly on the generator that hummed away in my backyard like a mechanical guardian angel. I showed up to the HOA meeting at 8 a.m. as requested, more out of curiosity than any sense of obligation. It was held in Patricia's living room since the community center had no power. About 15 people were crammed into her space, most of them looking tired and cranky. I recognized the HOA president, a thin woman named Barbara Jenkins who always wore reading glasses on a chain, and the treasurer, a retired accountant named Donald Walsh. Patricia wasted no time. As you all know, we had a severe power outage last night that's continuing into today. One of our residents, Xavier Novak, has a generator powerful enough to help the community but refused to share it when asked. Several heads turned in my direction, and I felt the weight of their collective exhaustion and irritation. That's not exactly accurate, I said, keeping my voice level. I have a generator designed for my house. It's not capable of powering multiple homes safely. You're an electrician, aren't you? Barbara asked, peering at me over her glasses. Surely you would know how to make it work. I'm an electrical engineer, and that's exactly why I know it won't work. My generator is rated for 20 kilowatts. An average house needs about 5 kilowatts to run essential systems. If I tried to power even 4 houses, I'd be over capacity. The generator would fail, possibly catastrophically. But you're only using it for yourself right now, Patricia interjected. So you have all that extra capacity going to waste while your neighbors suffer. It's not going to waste. My house uses what it uses, and the generator is sized appropriately for that load with some safety margin. I can't just plug in extension cords and hope for the best. That's not how electrical systems work. Donald Walsh cleared his throat. What if we made it official? What if the HOA formally requested your assistance and agreed to cover any costs or damages? I could see where this was going, and I didn't like it one bit. Even if you agreed to cover costs, which I doubt you'd actually follow through on, it doesn't change the physics of the situation. My generator cannot safely power multiple homes. We're not talking about powering everything, Patricia said, her voice taking on that patient tone people use when they think you're being deliberately obtuse. Just the essentials. Refrigerators, a few lights, maybe some fans. People are suffering out there, Xavier. Call the power company. Call emergency services if people have genuine medical needs. Call the Red Cross. But don't ask me to do something that could destroy my equipment and potentially start an electrical fire in someone's house. Barbara removed her glasses and let them hang from their chain. Xavier, I'm going to be frank with you. We have rules in this community about being good neighbors. If you continue to refuse to help when you have the means to do so, the board will have no choice but to take action. What kind of action? I asked, though I already suspected I knew. We can issue fines for violation of community standards. We can place liens on your property. We can make your life very difficult." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Or you could simply be a decent human being and help your neighbors for a day or two until the power is restored." The room had gone quiet, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me. They were hot, tired, and uncomfortable, and I was the guy with air conditioning and cold beer. I was the villain in their story, even though I was the only one talking sense. "If I do this, and I'm not saying I will, I would need a written agreement from the HOA accepting all liability for any damage to my generator or any property damage that results from overloading the electrical system." Patricia's smile widened. "Of course. We can draw something up right now." "Donald, you can write that up, can't you?" The treasurer nodded eagerly, already pulling out a laptop that was running on battery power. "Absolutely. We'll make it official." I should have walked out right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that this was a terrible idea, that Patricia Hammond and her HOA cronies were going to hang me out to dry the moment something went wrong. But I was surrounded by tired neighbors who just wanted their refrigerators to work, and I was being painted as the selfish jerk who wouldn't lift a finger to help. "Fine," I heard myself say, and I immediately regretted it. "But we're doing this properly. I'm going to calculate the maximum safe load, and I'm personally going to set up all connections. No one touches my equipment except me, and I'm only powering essential items, nothing more." The relief in the room was palpable. People started thanking me, patting me on the back, and Patricia looked positively triumphant. Donald typed away on his laptop, supposedly creating the liability agreement I'd requested, but I had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to be worth the paper it was printed on. After the meeting broke up, I went home and did the math. My generator could theoretically handle about 15 kilowatts of continuous load before hitting danger zones. That meant I could maybe service 3 houses plus my own if everyone was very careful about what they ran. But Patricia had other ideas. She showed up at my door an hour later with a hand-drawn map of the street. "I've talked to everyone, and here's what we're thinking. We have 17 houses on this street. If we rotate who gets power in shifts, everyone can at least get a few hours to cool down and keep their food from spoiling." "Patricia, that's not going to work. I can't power 17 houses, not even in rotation. The startup surge alone from all those air conditioners and refrigerators cycling on and off would kill my generator in a day." "You said you had extra capacity," she accused, as if I'd personally lied to her. "I said I had safety margin for my house. That doesn't translate to powering the whole neighborhood." We argued for another 20 minutes, and I finally agreed to a compromise that I knew was still too much. I would run heavy-duty extension cords to 6 houses, the ones with the most pressing needs. Mrs. Chen with the newborn, the Rodriguezes with medical equipment, an elderly couple named the Thompsons, and 3 other families that Patricia deemed most deserving. Each house would be limited to running only a refrigerator, a few lights, and either 1 fan or 1 small window AC unit. I spent the next 4 hours in the brutal Arizona heat running industrial-grade extension cords from my backyard generator to various houses along the street. I used proper gauge wire, calculated voltage drop, and set up individual breakers for each connection. I labeled everything, wrote out explicit instructions about what could and couldn't be plugged in, and made everyone sign a sheet acknowledging they understood the limitations. By 2 p.m., I had 6 houses connected, and my generator was running at about 70% capacity. It was higher than I liked, but still within safe operating parameters. I went inside my own house, which was now noticeably warmer since I'd had to scale back my own AC usage to accommodate the neighborhood, and tried to tell myself this would all be over soon. The power company had updated their estimate. The transformer repair would take at least another full day, possibly two. I considered the possibility that I'd be running this setup for 48 hours or more, and my stomach churned. That evening, Patricia stopped by again. "Xavier, we have a problem. The Hendersons on the corner are very upset that they're not included. Mrs. Henderson has diabetes and needs to keep her insulin refrigerated. Then she should call her doctor or emergency services. They can provide her with a cooler and ice packs." That's standard protocol. She shouldn't have to do that when you have a generator right here that could help her. "Patricia, I'm already running at capacity. I cannot add another house. The Rodriguezes said they could make do without the lights if it means Mrs. Henderson can keep her insulin cold." I rubbed my face, feeling the beginnings of a headache forming behind my eyes. "Fine. I'll run one more line, but only for a small refrigerator, nothing else, and I need to inspect what she's plugging in personally." Mrs. Henderson's small refrigerator turned out to be a full-size kitchen model, but I managed to make it work by asking 2 other houses to turn off their fans during peak hours. My generator was now running at 85% capacity, and I was checking on it every hour, watching the temperature gauges and listening for any signs of strain. At midnight, I was awakened by loud voices outside. I looked out my window to see several neighbors standing in the street, apparently having a heated discussion. I threw on clothes and went out to investigate. "What's going on?" A man named Greg from 4 houses down stepped forward. "Some people aren't following the rules." I walked past the Thompsons' house, and they've got their TV on, running their AC on full blast, and every light in the house is blazing. I felt my blood pressure spike. I'd been very clear about the limitations. I walked over to the Thompsons' house and knocked on the door. Mr. Thompson answered, looking sheepish. "I told you refrigerator, lights, and 1 cooling device," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You're running way more than that." "It's just for a little while," Mrs. Thompson called from inside. "We have guests over and it's so hot." "I don't care if you have the Pope visiting. You're going to overload the entire system. Shut it down now, or I'm disconnecting you entirely." They grumbled but complied, and I went back home hoping that was the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next day and a half, I dealt with a constant stream of problems. People kept plugging in unauthorized devices. The Chens decided they needed to run a space heater in the baby's room because they thought it was too cold. Someone tried to plug in a hot tub pump. Another neighbor attempted to run power tools in his garage. Each time, I had to march over, explain yet again why this was dangerous, and threaten to cut people off entirely. By Thursday afternoon, I was exhausted, sunburned from constantly being outside to check connections, and completely done with my neighbors. The power company had pushed their estimate back again, now saying Friday evening at the earliest. My generator had been running for over 60 hours straight, well beyond what I'd planned for, and I was going through fuel at an alarming rate. Patricia showed up Thursday evening with more demands. "Xavier, we need to expand the system. More people are having issues, and it's not fair that only some houses are getting help." "No, absolutely not. I'm already running beyond safe limits. You keep saying that, but the generator is still working fine," she said dismissively. "I think you're being overly cautious." "I'm being appropriately cautious. This is exactly why I didn't want to do this in the first place." "Well, the HOA board met again today, and we've decided that if you won't voluntarily expand the system, we'll need to bring in an outside electrician to assess whether you're actually at capacity or just being selfish." I stared at her in disbelief. You want to bring in someone else to override my professional judgment about my own equipment. We need an objective opinion. Fine. Bring someone in, but they'll tell you exactly what I've been telling you. She left with a satisfied expression, and I knew she thought she'd won some kind of victory. That night, I barely slept, getting up every couple of hours to check the generator, top off the fuel, and make sure nothing had caught fire. Friday morning, Patricia arrived with a man she introduced as Carl, a licensed electrician who's going to help us optimize the system. Carl looked like he'd been dragged out of a comfortable retirement, and he wasn't happy about it. Patricia had clearly promised him something, because he seemed obligated to be there despite his obvious reluctance. I showed him my setup, explained my calculations, and walked him through the current load distribution. He pulled out a multimeter, took some readings, and examined the generator specifications. "You're actually running too hot already," he said to Patricia. "Xavier here has done a decent job managing it, but this generator shouldn't be servicing this many houses. You're asking for trouble." Patricia's face flushed. "But it's been working fine for 3 days. Madam, just because something hasn't failed yet doesn't mean it won't. This is like running your car engine at redline continuously. Sure, it'll work for a while, but you're drastically shortening the lifespan of the equipment and risking catastrophic failure." "So you're taking his side," she said accusingly. "I'm taking physics' side," Carl replied dryly. "Look, I understand people are uncomfortable, but the power company says they'll have everything fixed by tonight. You've made it this far. Just leave things as they are and don't push your luck." After Carl left, Patricia looked at me with barely concealed anger. "I hope you're happy. You've convinced everyone that you're the victim here when you could have done more to help." "I did help, against my better judgment. And now, I'm probably going to need to service or replace my generator because I ran it beyond reasonable limits for your sake." She didn't respond, just turned and walked away with her phone pressed to her ear, no doubt calling other board members to complain about me. The power came back on Friday evening at 7:30 p.m., and I'd never been so relieved to hear the collective cheer that went up from the neighborhood. I immediately began the process of disconnecting all the extension cords, labeling them for storage, and shutting down my generator properly. The generator itself was hot enough to cook on, and I could smell that particular metallic scent that meant components had been stressed. I'd need to do a full inspection and probably replace some parts, but at least it hadn't blown up. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Saturday morning, Patricia appeared at my door again, this time with Barbara and Donald in tow. All three of them looked grim. "Xavier, we need to discuss the damage," Patricia said without preamble. "What damage?" "Several residents have reported that their electronics were damaged when the power came back on. TVs, computers, appliances. The Rodriguez's medical equipment isn't working properly. Mrs. Chen's breast pump is fried." I felt cold dread settle in my stomach. "What are you talking about? I disconnected everything before the grid power came back on." "Apparently not soon enough," Barbara said, "or something about your generator setup caused a power surge. Either way, we have thousands of dollars in damages that need to be addressed." "That's impossible. I was very careful about the disconnection sequence." "Nevertheless, it happened," Patricia said with a thin smile. "And according to the agreement you signed, you accepted responsibility for any damages resulting from your generator setup. Let me see that agreement." I held out my hand, and Donald reluctantly passed over a printed document. I read through it quickly, my heart sinking with each sentence. The liability agreement I thought I'd been signing, the one that said the HOA would take responsibility, had been changed. This version stated that I, Xavier Novak, accepted full liability for any and all damages resulting from the use of my generator to power neighboring homes. It was signed with my name, but I'd never seen this version before. "This isn't what I signed," I said slowly. "This is completely different from what Donald showed me on his laptop." "That's your signature, isn't it?" Patricia pointed to the bottom of the page. "Yes, but not on this document." "What the hell did you do? Did you forge this?" "That's a serious accusation," Barbara said. "We have a signed agreement from you. If you're now claiming you didn't sign it, that's a separate issue. But as it stands, we have multiple residents who are owed compensation for damaged property." I looked at the three of them, at their coordinated expressions of false concern, and realized I'd been set up from the very beginning. They'd pushed me into helping, knowing something would go wrong, and they'd prepared a fake agreement to hang the blame on me. "I want my lawyer to look at this," I said. "And I'm not paying for anything until I have an independent investigation into what actually caused these supposed damages." "That's your right," Patricia said smoothly. "But until this is resolved, the HOA will be placing a lien on your property for the estimated damages of $47,000. $47,000. Are you insane? That's the preliminary assessment. It may go higher once everyone has had a chance to fully document their losses." They left me standing in my doorway, holding a fraudulent document and facing the financial ruin they'd engineered. I immediately called my lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel Goldstein who'd handled my home purchase and occasionally did consultation work for me. "They did what?" Rachel's voice on the phone was incredulous. "Xavier, tell me you kept the original document they showed you." "No, it was on a laptop screen. Donald said he'd print it out and I signed it, but I didn't see the printed version clearly. I was focused on getting the whole mess set up and running." "Okay, don't panic. This sounds like fraud, which means we're not in small claims territory anymore. I'm going to need you to write down everything you remember, every conversation, every interaction. Get me a list of everyone who was at that HOA meeting." Over the weekend, I worked with Rachel to build my case. I took detailed photos of my generator setup, documented my fuel receipts, and wrote out a timeline of every interaction with the HOA. I also started calling the neighbors who claimed damages, asking if I could see the broken equipment personally. Mrs. Chen agreed to let me look at her breast pump. When I examined it, I found the issue immediately. Someone had plugged it into the extension cord system I'd set up, which should have been impossible since I'd clearly labeled what could and couldn't be used. More importantly, the damage pattern wasn't consistent with a power surge. It looked like the unit had been dropped or struck with something. "Mrs. Chen, did you actually plug this into my extension cord?" I asked carefully. She looked uncomfortable. "Patricia said I should. She said it was fine, that you had plenty of capacity." "When did you plug it in?" "Thursday night, I think. The baby needed to be fed and I needed to pump." "And when did it break?" "I don't know. I tried to use it Saturday morning after the power came back and it wouldn't turn on. Patricia said it must have been damaged by your generator." I took photos of the damage and thanked her. The next stop was the Rodriguez's house to examine their medical equipment. Mr. Rodriguez, a kind man in his 50s, showed me the respiratory monitor they used for their son. "I'm really sorry about this, Xavier," he said as soon as I arrived. "Patricia said we had to report the damage or the HOA wouldn't help cover our costs. But honestly, I don't think your generator had anything to do with it." "What do you mean?" The monitor was acting up before the power outage. We'd been meaning to get it serviced but hadn't gotten around to it. When Patricia started collecting reports of damages, she called us specifically and suggested we add our monitor to the list. "She told you to claim it was damaged by my generator even though it wasn't." He looked miserable. "She said it was for the good of the community." That you had insurance that would cover it. I'm sorry, man. I shouldn't have gone along with it. I gathered evidence from 3 more houses, and the pattern was the same. Either the equipment had been broken before, or the damage was inconsistent with an electrical surge, or Patricia had specifically coached people to blame me. By Monday morning, I had enough documentation to show that the HOA was running an insurance fraud scheme. Rachel reviewed everything I'd gathered. This is good, Xavier. Really good. We have evidence of fraud, coercion, and false claims. I'm going to file a complaint with the Arizona Attorney General's office and also prepare a lawsuit against the HOA for fraud and defamation. But first, I want to have a meeting with their board and give them a chance to back down. Tuesday afternoon, we sat down with Patricia, Barbara, and Donald in a conference room at a local library, neutral territory. Rachel didn't waste any time. My client has evidence that the damage claims filed against him are fraudulent, that residents were coached to make false reports, and that the liability agreement presented to him was materially different from what he agreed to sign. If the HOA does not immediately withdraw all claims and remove any liens, we will be filing both civil and criminal complaints. Patricia's lawyer, a nervous man named Tim who looked like he desperately wished he'd chosen a different client, reviewed the evidence Rachel presented. I watched his face go pale as he flipped through the photos, the written statements from residents, and the analysis of the supposedly damaged equipment. "Patricia, can I speak with you privately?" Tim asked, his voice strained. They excused themselves, along with Barbara and Donald. Rachel and I waited in the conference room, and I could hear raised voices from down the hall. When they returned, Patricia looked like she'd been sucking on lemons. "There appears to have been some miscommunication about the nature and extent of the damages," she said stiffly. "The HOA is willing to withdraw its claims." "That's not enough," Rachel said calmly. "My client wants a full written apology, acknowledgement that no damages were caused by his generator, removal of any liens or negative reports, and reimbursement for his legal fees and generator maintenance costs." "That's ridiculous," Patricia snapped. "We're offering to drop this and he should be grateful." Tim put his hand on Patricia's arm. "Patricia, please let me handle this." He turned to Rachel. "What's the total for legal fees and maintenance?" $3,000 for maintenance, and my fees so far are $2,000. So $5,000 total, plus the written apology and acknowledgement. Tim looked at his clients. Donald seemed to be doing mental calculations, probably about what this would do to the HOA's finances. Barbara was staring at the table, her reading glasses in her hand. Patricia looked ready to explode. "We'll need to call an emergency board meeting," Donald finally said. "We can't authorize that kind of payment without a vote." "Fine," Rachel said. "You have 48 hours. After that, we file with the Attorney General." The emergency meeting was held Wednesday evening, and this time more than half the neighborhood showed up. Word had spread about what was really going on, and people were angry. They'd been manipulated by Patricia and her cronies, their names used in false damage claims, and they wanted answers. I stood up and explained everything, showing the evidence I'd gathered, the photos of equipment that was clearly damaged by impact rather than electrical surge, the statements from residents admitting they'd been coached to lie. The room erupted in shouting, with most of it directed at Patricia. "You told me Xavier's insurance would cover it," Mrs. Chen yelled, holding her baby. "You said it wouldn't hurt him." "You made me think I was helping the community," Mr. Rodriguez added. "Instead, you were running a scam." Barbara tried to restore order, but it was clear she'd lost control of the meeting. After an hour of chaos, a vote was finally held. The motion to pay my demands passed overwhelmingly, with only Patricia voting against it, but I wasn't done yet. I want to add one more thing. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in the current board leadership. Patricia Hammond has abused her position, engaged in fraud, and damaged this community. She needs to be removed. The vote was swift and decisive. Patricia, Barbara, and Donald were all removed from the board, effective immediately. Patricia stood up, her face purple with rage, and pointed at me. "You've ruined everything. This community was fine before you moved in with your attitude and your refusal to be a team player. I was trying to help people. You were trying to run a scam," I said quietly. "And when that didn't work, you tried to commit fraud and destroy me financially. I hope it was worth it." She stormed out, and I later learned she put her house up for sale within a week. But that wasn't quite the end of the story. On Friday, 2 detectives from the Scottsdale Police Department showed up at my door. My first thought was that Patricia had somehow convinced them I was the criminal, but they quickly set me straight. "Mr. Novak, we're investigating a fraud complaint filed by the Arizona Attorney General's office. We understand you have evidence related to insurance fraud and false claims perpetrated by your HOA." I invited them in and spent the next 2 hours going through everything again. They took copies of all my documentation, including the recorded statements I'd gathered from neighbors and the forensic analysis of the supposedly damaged equipment. "This is pretty clear-cut," the older detective said. "We'll be referring this to the county attorney for prosecution. You might be called as a witness. What charges are we talking about? Fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, possibly forgery depending on what our handwriting analysts say about that signature on the modified agreement. Miss Hammond could be looking at serious time if convicted." I'd wanted accountability, but hearing it laid out in terms of actual criminal charges made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "What about the others?" "Barbara and Donald. We'll investigate their level of involvement. If they were active participants in the fraud, they'll face charges too. If they were just negligent, that's a civil matter but not criminal." Over the next few months, I watched the case unfold through a mixture of direct involvement and neighborhood gossip. Patricia was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. Barbara and Donald weren't charged criminally, but faced civil lawsuits from residents who'd been dragged into the scheme. The HOA itself underwent a complete restructuring. New board members were elected. Bylaws were rewritten to prevent future abuses of power, and there was serious discussion about dissolving the association entirely and converting to a less restrictive community organization. As for me, I got my $5,000 plus an additional settlement from the HOA's insurance company once they realized what Patricia had been up to. My generator got a full professional maintenance overhaul, which revealed that I'd been right about the strain it had been under. Several components had been on the verge of failure. The criminal trial happened about 8 months later. I testified about the pressure to share my generator, the fake liability agreement, and the coordinated campaign to fabricate damage claims. Patricia's defense tried to paint her as a well-meaning volunteer who'd made some mistakes in judgment, but the evidence was overwhelming. She was convicted on 6 counts of fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who clearly had no patience for HOA drama, sentenced Patricia to 3 years in prison and ordered her to pay restitution to everyone who'd been affected, including me. Standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing, Mr. Rodriguez found me. "Thank you for not letting her get away with it. I felt terrible about what happened, about being part of it." "You were a victim too," I said. "She manipulated a lot of good people. Still, what you did Gathering all that evidence and fighting back, it took guts. A lot of people would have just paid to make it go away. I thought about that on the drive home. He was probably right. It would have been easier to pay some amount and move on with my life. But something about the calculated way Patricia had set me up, the casual way she tried to destroy my finances and reputation, had ignited something in me that wouldn't let it go. The new HOA board was completely different from the old one. They actually listened to residents, focused on genuine community improvements rather than petty enforcement of arbitrary rules, and stayed the hell out of people's personal business. It was a novel concept for a homeowners association. I kept my generator, of course, and maintained it carefully. But I made it absolutely clear, in writing and in person, that it was for my personal use only. If there was ever another extended power outage, I'd be happy to help neighbors by sharing ice or providing phone charging. But I was never again running extension cords across the street to power someone else's house. The whole experience taught me some valuable lessons about community living, about the kind of petty tyranny that can flourish in neighborhood associations, and about the importance of documenting everything when dealing with people who have even a small amount of power and an inflated sense of their own authority. It also taught me that Arizona summers without air conditioning were brutal, that neighbors could be both wonderful and terrible depending on who was leading them, and that standing up to bullies, even bureaucratic HOA bullies, was worth the stress and expense. My street eventually became known throughout Scottsdale as the neighborhood that took down its corrupt HOA board. Real estate agents mentioned it as a selling point, which was both amusing and slightly embarrassing. I got occasional calls from people in other neighborhoods dealing with their own HOA problems, asking for advice on how to fight back. I always told them the same thing: document everything, get a good lawyer, and don't let them intimidate you into doing something you know is wrong. And maybe, just maybe, think twice before buying a house with an HOA in the first place. The generator still sits in my backyard, a big industrial beast that kept me comfortable through that nightmare week and almost became my financial ruin. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I go out and check on it, make sure it's ready for the next emergency. But these days, I'm the only one it's protecting, and that's exactly how I want it to stay. Life in the neighborhood settled into a comfortable rhythm after all the drama. People were friendlier, more willing to help each other in normal ways that didn't involve fraudulent damage claims or forced sharing of personal property. The new board actually accomplished things, like getting the community pool repaired and organizing a neighborhood watch that focused on actual safety rather than measuring people's grass height. I even became friendly with several of the neighbors who'd been caught up in Patricia's scheme. Mrs. Chen and her husband brought me homemade dumplings as an apology, which was completely unnecessary but delicious. The Rodriguezes invited me over for a barbecue, and their son, the one with the medical equipment, turned out to be a funny kid who loved the same video games I did. The Thompsons, the elderly couple who tried to run every appliance in their house on my generator, sent me a handwritten apology note and a gift card to a local steakhouse. I appreciated the gesture, even though I'd already forgiven them. They'd just been hot and uncomfortable, making bad decisions under Patricia's encouragement. About a year after everything went down, I ran into Tim, Patricia's former lawyer, at a coffee shop. He looked considerably more relaxed than the last time I'd seen him. "Xavier, right?" he said, approaching my table. I wanted to say, "I'm glad how everything turned out. Well, not for my former client, but for justice, I guess." "That must have been a rough case for you," I said, gesturing for him to sit if he wanted. He sat down with his coffee, looking sheepish. I should have dropped her as a client the moment I saw your evidence. But she'd already paid a retainer, and I convinced myself I could negotiate a settlement. I didn't realize how deep her issues went. Live and learn, I said. I don't do HOA work anymore, he admitted. After that case, I decided I'd rather do literally anything else. The power dynamics are too weird, and people get too invested in things that don't really matter. We talked for a while about the case, about what had happened to Patricia in prison. Apparently not well, she was having a hard time adjusting, and about the general insanity of homeowners associations. It was a surprisingly pleasant conversation. As I left the coffee shop, I reflected on how the whole situation had changed my perspective on community living. I'd moved to a planned community because I thought it would be safe, clean, and well-maintained. And it was all those things, but I'd underestimated the cost of achieving them. HOA, in theory, are meant to protect property values and maintain community standards. In practice, they often become little fiefdoms run by people who have never had real authority in their lives and don't know how to wield it responsibly. Patricia Hammond was a perfect example. A middle-aged woman with too much time on her hands and a desperate need to feel important. She'd seen the power outage not as a temporary inconvenience to be endured, but as an opportunity to demonstrate her leadership and control her neighbors. When I refused to fall in line, I became a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. The fraud scheme wasn't something she did out of malice, at least not initially. It was probably her twisted way of justifying to herself that she'd been right all along, that I was selfish and deserved to be punished. The scary part was how close she'd come to succeeding. If I hadn't been an electrical engineer who knew to document everything, if I hadn't had the resources to hire a lawyer, if the neighbors hadn't eventually told the truth about what really happened, I could have been stuck with tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent claims and a permanent black mark on my credit. 2 years after the trial, I was working in my garage workshop on a Saturday afternoon when a car pulled up that I didn't recognize. A young woman got out, probably in her late 20s, and approached with a cautious smile. "Are you Xavier Novak?" she asked. "That's me. Can I help you?" "I'm Amy Rodriguez, Carlos's daughter. He talks about you all the time. I'm actually looking at houses in this neighborhood, and I wanted to ask what it's like living here now, after everything that happened." I invited her to sit on my porch, offered her some iced tea, and we talked about the neighborhood, the new HOA, and what had changed since Patricia's reign of terror. "It's actually pretty great now," I told her honestly. "The new board is functional and reasonable. They focus on real issues like street maintenance and community events. No one's measuring your mailbox or counting how many plants you have in your yard. My dad said you were the one who stood up to the old board. That took guts." "More like stubbornness and a refusal to be scammed," I said with a laugh. "But yeah, someone had to say no. The thing about bullies, even bureaucratic ones, is that they rely on people being too tired or scared to fight back. Once you actually challenge them, they usually crumble." She bought a house 3 streets over from mine, and it was nice to know that the neighborhood was attracting young families again. For a while after the trial, property values had dipped because no one wanted to live in that crazy HOA neighborhood. But as word spread about the reforms and the new leadership, things had bounced back. I learned to be more involved in HOA matters, not because I enjoyed going to meetings, but because I realized that civic participation was the price of keeping people like Patricia from taking over again. I served on a committee to revise the bylaws, making sure there were proper checks and balances built in, clear appeals processes, and strict limitations on board authority. We added a clause specifically addressing emergency situations, making it clear that residents were never required to share personal property or equipment for community use. It was probably unnecessary, but I wanted it in writing so no one could ever pull that stunt again. My generator remained a topic of neighborhood legend. During subsequent power outages, which happened occasionally during summer storm season, people would joke about how my house was the only one with lights on. But no one asked to plug in, and I didn't offer. Instead, I'd invite neighbors over to charge their phones or store some perishables in my refrigerator, things that were actually helpful without putting strain on my equipment or setting up complicated liability issues. 3 years after Patricia's sentencing, she was released from prison on parole. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to California to live with her sister, as far from Scottsdale and her past as she could get. I felt a mixture of relief and something like pity. She destroyed her own life over HOA drama and wounded pride. Barbara and Donald, the other former board members, had both moved away as well. Barbara went to a retirement community in Florida, and Donald relocated for his wife's job. Neither had been charged criminally, but the civil judgments and social stigma had made staying in the neighborhood untenable. On the 5-year anniversary of the Great Generator incident, as it had come to be known, the neighborhood threw a block party. It wasn't officially about what had happened, but everyone knew the subtext. We'd survived a near destruction of our community and come out stronger on the other side. I stood in the middle of the street, which had been closed off for the party, watching kids run around with sidewalk chalk while adults mingled with drinks and conversation. Mrs. Chen's baby, now an energetic 5-year-old, was teaching other kids some elaborate game involving a lot of screaming and running. The Rodriguezes had brought enough grilled meat to feed an army. The Thompsons, now in their late 70s, sat in lawn chairs telling stories to anyone who would listen. Someone tapped me on the shoulder and I turned to find Rachel, my lawyer, who'd become a friend over the years. "How does it feel to be a neighborhood legend?" she asked with a grin. "Weird, mostly. I just wanted to not get scammed." "You did more than that. You held people accountable and changed an entire community's culture. That's not nothing." I suppose she was right. What had started as a simple refusal to do something unsafe and unreasonable had spiraled into a full-blown legal battle that exposed corruption and led to real consequences for people who abused their authority. It had been stressful and expensive and time-consuming, but looking around at my neighbors, at the functional community we'd built from the ashes of Patricia's schemes, I felt pretty good about how it had turned out. My generator sat in my backyard, recently serviced and ready for whatever emergencies might come. But these days, it was just a generator, not a community resource, not a source of conflict, not a tool for someone else to manipulate me with. Just a reliable piece of equipment that did what it was designed to do: keep my house running when the power went out, and really, that was all it ever should have been. As the sun set on the block party and the desert air began to cool from absolutely brutal to merely unpleasant, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. I'd moved to Scottsdale looking for a quiet place to work and live, and instead I'd found drama, fraud, legal battles, and eventually a kind of redemption. The HOA world was still full of Patricias, petty tyrants with too much time and too little perspective. But it was also full of good people who just wanted to live in peace, who would stand up for what was right when given the chance, and who could build something better when the corrupt structures were torn down. I'd learned that fighting back was worth it, that documentation was everything, that a good lawyer was worth their weight in gold, and that communities could heal and grow if people were willing to put in the work. Most importantly, I'd learned that my property was my property. My generator was my generator, and no amount of HOA pressure or manufactured emergencies would ever make me forget that again. Sometimes being a good neighbor means helping out. But sometimes it means standing your ground and saying no, especially when saying yes would be dangerous or when people are trying to exploit your kindness. The street lights came on, the municipal power grid humming along like nothing had ever been wrong. Someone started music playing, and a few people began to dance. Kids chased fireflies in the dimming light. The smell of barbecue hung in the air, mixed with the unique scent of Arizona desert evening. It was just a neighborhood block party, nothing special by most standards. But to those of us who'd lived through the generator wars and come out the other side, it was a celebration of resilience, justice, and the possibility of change. And that was worth celebrating indeed.